there, and welcome to Labour Media. Recently, I interviewed Isaac from the Lefty podcast, a good comrade of mine, and the topic of socialist patriotism came up. If you've been frankly too online in leftist spaces, you've likely come across many of the people who deem themselves socialist patriots or patriotic socialists, a fringe sect of Marxism-Leninism that advocates patriotism as a tactic. What patriotism means is a matter we'll debate later. The sect has gained some infamy as of recent, not merely from their eccentric thought leaders, but because of their frankly wild takes, from the Queen of England controls the US, Russia invading Ukraine good, and apparently Oliver Cromwell was a man of the people. Communism is when you genocide the Irish, apparently. So yes, a lot of patsocks come out with comically bad takes, be it raging against completely sensible and acceptable Marxist talking points, or saying that ex-historical figure that existed before the capitalist epoch was somehow a communist, despite those figures usually being empire-building dictators like Caesar, Cromwell, and Napoleon, for some reason, notwithstanding the general social conservative tendency. Call it what you will, social chauvinism, campism, right-wing communism, you can't see but I'm making air quotes. We won't be discussing these takes today. To make a value judgment on the idea of socialist patriotism, we're going to analyse it devoid of these ideas and take it on face value and in good faith. We're going to discuss what patriotism means exactly, when it might be an acceptable technique, the issues around using imperial symbology and whether it is compatible with Marxism-Leninism. Let's get a move on. Defining patriotic socialism is tricky because of the patriotic aspect of the name. Whilst there are similar opinions held within the members of this circle to differing degrees, you can probably spot one if you know what to look for, defining patriotism is more difficult as it depends on how we define love for one's country. The patsocks I've heard discuss the matter define love for your country as love for your country's proletariat, something that there's nothing wrong with at all, within reason. Every communist should strive for the liberation of the proletariat of their own country, and because these RMLs we're talking about, this relates to the theory of socialism in one country, an ultimately international idea, but one that stresses the need to enshrine the victory of one revolution before trying to export revolution. If this is the case, why is this patriotism at all noticeable among this sect? Why will they be any different than the average socialist? Well, if we look at the recent Austin, Texas Center for Political Innovation conference, one organised by leading figures in the space such as Caleb Maupin, Peter Coffin, and this other knob called Haz or something, we see what separates this tendency when speaking on the aspects of patriotism alone. Draped in the US flag and with the backdrop of Lincoln, a callback to the CPUSA conference, this symbology, specifically Western symbology, we'll discuss this later, but suffice to say this tendency is mostly found in the US with some other examples in the UK and Canada, is what prevails within this ideology. According to the many patsocks I've seen and this article by RedStreetJournal, the tendency wish to not see this patriotic symbology be ceded to the bourgeoisie, that leaders who have not embraced such displays like Corbyn and Sanders failed because of such. They see the use of these symbols to be very useful to winning over the working class, as they already have positive opinions of their national flag and other pieces of cultural iconography. Now we have a definition to work from, socialists who believe in the use of patriotic iconography to establish socialism in one country within the imperial core. We can begin to analyse the value of tactics utilised by this tendency. Socialist patriotism as a tendency exists in the imperial core, predominantly in English-speaking countries from what I've seen, but it might go beyond there, don't know well on that, which is where we see the issue. There is advocacy within the tendency for combining the hammer and sickle with the Star-Spangled Banner and placing busts of Lenin next to monuments of Lincoln. They claim that patriotism appeals to the working class, but not only does this treat the working class as a homogeneous entity, it also forgets that patriotism of this sort is more often exclusionary. To quote the excellent On the Problem of Red Patriotism article from Peace, Land and Bread, however, the working class are far from homogeneous. The claim that a disdain towards patriotism alienates the working class should lead one to ask which segments of the working class are being considered and which are excluded and therefore alienated from this statement. It is safe to say that indigenous people generally are not moved by symbols of their ongoing genocide. In fact, it would be a gross oversimplification to assume that patriotism is a dominant or guiding principle either within the class as a whole or within most subsections of the class. Subsection weird there. In the absence of fully representational data, the Red Patriots rely on anecdotal evidence which cannot help but to abstract and oversimplify. The flags of the imperial powers have long waved over insurmountable genocide and exploitation. They are the oppressing forces of the world. Lincoln oversaw a mass execution of indigenous peoples and is by no means some representative of the working class, even if Marx wrote to him once. Of course, an attachment to these symbols does exist within the working class, but sections of the working class also believe in the current state of things, in the value of the capitalist system. All these things can be dismantled. We're not ceding anything to the bourgeoisie by not using patriotism as a tactic. As Gramsci wrote, the working class should form its own hegemony, different to that of the bourgeoisie. We should not make ourselves content with the flags of empire drenched in the blood of millions, but form our own symbols and our own iconography that is solely that of worker liberation. Now, there is the point many patsocs make about patriotic rhetoric from countries in the periphery, or from socialist countries, such as the USSR framing World War II as the Great Patriotic War, etc. This betrays a fundamental flaw in its analysis. It shows where patriotism can be a useful tactic, in the periphery and in socialist countries. One serves as an attack against imperialists, and one is to be patriotic to the people, for a socialist country is a nation of the people with a fundamentally different hegemony, a hegemony of the working class. To quote Mao on the issue, "Can a communist, who is an internationalist, at the same time be a patriot? We hold that he not only can be, but also must be. The specific content of patriotism is determined by historical conditions. There is the patriotism of the Japanese aggressors and of Hitler, and there is our patriotism. Communists must resolutely oppose the patriotism of the Japanese aggressors and of Hitler. The communists of Japan and Germany are defeatists with regard to the wars being waged by their countries. To bring about the defeat of the Japanese aggressors and of Hitler by every possible means is in the interest of the Japanese and the German people. And the more complete the defeat, the better, for the wars launched by the Japanese aggressors and Hitler are harming the people at home as well as the people of the world. China's case, however, is different, because she is the victim of aggression. China's communists must therefore combine patriotism and internationalism. We are at once internationalists and patriots. Our slogan is, fight to defend the motherland against the aggressors. For us, defeatism is a crime, and to strive for victory in the war of resistance is an inescapable duty. For only by fighting in the defence of the motherland can we defeat the aggressors and achieve national liberation. And only by achieving national liberation will it be possible for the proletariat and other working people to achieve their own emancipation. The victory of China and the defeat of the invading imperialists will help the people of other countries. Thus, in wars of national liberation, patriotism is applied internationalism. Communists in the imperial court should not venerate the iconography of their capitalist nation. Rather, they should focus single-mindedly on having the imperialism of their nation undermined by organising with the masses to create a hegemony separate from that of their oppressors. Whilst patsocs might point to their nation's history of working-class struggle with pride, it should be remembered that this struggle is in spite of the imperial banner. They were not received warmly by those operating under the bourgeois hegemony, but were attacked by such forces. To force that history to be adopted and congealed amongst the hegemony of that which oppresses such movements would be a grave mistake. Let's touch on more about this issue of workers in the core and workers in the periphery. Another thing that goes in line with this patriotic ideology is the melding of the labour aristocracy, workers in the core, and the workers in the periphery. Many outright saying that the labour aristocracy does not exist, and that workers in the core don't benefit from imperialism. Now, it would be foolish to say that the proletariat in the core are not oppressed, and to say that they do not share a common cause with the workers of the world. However, it is similarly foolish to say that the social democratic welfare states of the imperial powers are not funded by whole or by part through imperialism, through measures such as colonial taxes in equal exchange and arms dealing. It's a form of secondary contradiction that exists between workers of different countries. It's one of the reasons why social democracy is a failed idea that should not be pursued. To quote Engels in a letter to Marx, "The English proletariat is becoming more and more bourgeois, so that this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming ultimately at the position of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat as well as a bourgeoisie." Again, the proletariat of the core should work to undermine their country's imperialism whilst also fighting for demands in the home country. The proletariat of the core have the same interests as the proletariat of the periphery, but we cannot pretend that many of the privileges we enjoy in the core are built off the immense suffering of the periphery. We cannot allow ourselves to fall into the trap of thinking social democracy is ever enough. This isn't something every patsoc will think, but I've seen enough for them to be wary of it and to bring it up here. In conclusion, I don't believe patriotic socialism to be a useful technique. It seems to me far more alienating than it is inclusive, not merely to the portions of the national population or the world population that are disproportionately affected by the onslaught represented by this imperial symbology, but so too on the working class as a whole. The workers of the core should not wish to see imperial symbology flourish. We must see it destroyed, along with the bloodied history it represents. Workers of the world, unite. Thank you for watching. As always, the transcript will be available in the description, as well as the sources for the quotes and the articles on patriotism, both by RedStreetJournal and by Peace, Land and Bread, so we get a balanced look at the different ideas. Funny enough, the Mao quote I used, which I think is one of the strongest arguments against patriotic socialism, was actually from the RedStreetJournal article. That was a bit of a cell phone on their part. But yeah, go on, make your own decisions on that there in the description. I'm going to forget something important, I just know it. Next video will be on the dictatorship of the proletariat and how essentially it is, well, I would say, the most revised concept in socialism. It's basically the one thing even many very principled socialists are misinformed about and don't understand the history of. So I think that would be a good topic for a video. Is that everything? Okay, well, I certainly hope it is. I made a transcript. I think I made a transcript. Yeah, so this has been Labour Media, and remember, Labour conquers all.